On a winter morning in 2019, with Kentucky frost still clinging to the ground and a thin veil of mist drifting over the bare fields, Rachel and Thomas Alden stepped into the old Merritt House kitchen to begin another day of repairs. They just wanted to make the place warm again, a new start after a hard stretch of life. But minutes later, they would be standing still in the middle of the room, not because of the house's charm, but because of a sound they had just heard, a hollow, deep, frigid echo rising from beneath their feet. Thomas tapped the floor again. The vibration came back sharper this time, as if the ground underneath wasn't ground at all but a void waiting for someone to acknowledge it. Rachel met his eyes, curiosity tangled with unease. They'd heard stories about this house, the kind whispered across decades, but like most young couples desperate for a fresh chapter, they believed old tragedies were just ghosts of the past, dust and rotting boards. Nothing more. That illusion vanished the moment the first plank came up. Beneath the gray flooring lay a circular slab of concrete, poured thick and cut in a rushed, uneven shape. It looked like something someone had tried to hide quickly, desperately hoping it would never see daylight again. When Thomas ran his fingers along the concrete edge, Rachel felt a shiver crawl across her skin. The air shifted denser now, tinged with the scent of damp earth rising from somewhere far below. By late afternoon, they had pried loose the first pieces of concrete. A cold draft spilled upward, not violent, but chilling enough to silence the entire kitchen. A narrow passage appeared under the flashlight beam, steep and dark, the light catching only the first few steps before the rest dissolved into blackness. Rachel grabbed her husband's hand, feeling the cold on his skin. For several long seconds, they didn't speak, standing at the threshold of something they weren't sure they should open. Thomas went down a few steps to check for safety. His voice quivered when he called back up. There were shelves, he said, old ones, shadows of objects buried under layers of dust thick enough to feel like generations had slept on top of them. He didn't go farther. Something in that stale, silent space pushed him back, tightening his breath. The next morning, they notified the county office. 2 investigators arrived, expecting to find an abandoned root cellar or part of an old foundation. But once they descended, once their flashlights swept across the far end of the chamber, one of them froze. Half buried in the dirt were objects so small yet unmistakable to any parent. A child's watch, stopped at 3:17, a tiny necklace with a star-shaped pendant, and a shoe far too small, far too clean around the laces, to be a random piece of debris. Around 2 that afternoon, from the investigator's phone came a call no one had imagined hearing again in 33 years, a call that reopened the disappearance of the 5 Larkin siblings, a case that once kept all of Kentucky awake at night, then slowly sank into silence as the years passed, with no sign, no clue, no trace. But now, beneath the kitchen floor of a forgotten house, that silence had finally begun to crack. Before the small objects were found beneath the Merritt House kitchen floor, the name Larkin had already been a lingering ache in the town of Manchester. Not because the family was famous, not because they were wealthy or prominent, but because of what they lost in the summer of 1986, a loss that left a wound the entire community never quite healed from. The 5 Larkin siblings grew up on a small farm 7 miles outside town, where mornings began with the sound of roosters and evenings ended with crickets humming across the fields. They were the kind of family people naturally loved: gentle parents, well-mannered children, and a weathered farmhouse filled with laughter. Rachel, 19, was the oldest, soft-spoken, tender, the sort of young woman people said carried an old soul's heart. She dreamed of studying nursing, of seeing the world, yet always imagined coming home to care for her parents someday. David, 17, loved tinkering with machinery. Awkward hands, steady grin. Patient as a summer evening, the twins, Emma and Eli, 14, were the home's bright pulse, one always sketching, the other always running, and neither ever more than a few steps apart, as if the world only made sense when the other was near. And finally Matthew, 9, forever trailing behind, clutching a worn comic book, eyes wide with questions about their next adventure. They were so inseparable that neighbors simply called them the Larkin 5. 5 children who moved, laughed, and lived as one, never imagining fate could pull them apart. On July 12th of that year, they borrowed their father's old pickup to explore the Merritt House, an abandoned place that had fueled a dozen half-whispered stories among local kids all summer. To the Larkin siblings, it was nothing more than an afternoon adventure. A long Kentucky summer day stretching endlessly ahead. They left the farm at noon. Radio blaring. Wind tossing their hair. One neighbor still remembers watching them drive past, saying they laughed as though nothing in the world could ever harm them. But when the sun dipped behind the ridge, the Larkin home fell unusually quiet. No engine rolling into the yard. No footsteps bursting through the kitchen. No voices calling across the fields. Only darkness settling over the land, and a mother standing at the window, staring down the dirt road with a fear she couldn't name. That night, the Larkins called the sheriff, and from that moment on, the town stepped into a story no one imagined would stretch on for decades. To understand why the disappearance shattered the town of Manchester so deeply, you have to return to the people who made the Larkin farmhouse one of the warmest places in all of Kentucky. Each child carried a light of their own, and when those lights went out, the whole community seemed to lose its rhythm. Rachel was the gentlest soul among the five. At 19, she carried more maturity than most adults. She studied while helping her mother tend the garden, care for the younger ones, and restore calm whenever the house grew loud or chaotic. People used to say Rachel could make a room feel warmer simply by standing in it. She dreamed of becoming a nurse, then returning home to care for the town's elderly. Many still remember seeing her rock little Matthew to sleep under the old hickory tree in the yard, a young woman raised by farmland, but with a heart as wide as the sky above it. David, 17, was the anchor of his younger siblings. He loved repairing tractors and tinkering with things his father told him not to touch, then clumsily working them back into shape. Friends called him Fixer, the boy who could make anything work again. He was honest, quick to smile, and had a quiet instinct for the land. He was the first to hear the creek swell after a storm, the one who knew which shortcuts slipped through the trees when the heat grew unbearable. To Rachel, David was the wooden beam holding their world up. To the younger three, he was the hero who showed up whenever trouble did. Emma and Eli, the 14-year-old twins, were like two halves of the same wind. Emma, the introvert, spent hours drawing sparrows, fields, and old windows on scraps of paper. Eli, the extrovert, ran headlong into life, into creeks, into dares, into summer afternoons that never seemed long enough. But despite their differences, the two only felt complete when the other was close. People said they could communicate with a glance. In the last family photos, they stand shoulder to shoulder, smiles so bright they seem to lift the sunlight around them. And then there was Matthew, the youngest, the wide-eyed 9-year-old always bubbling with questions that made adults pause before answering. He was protected by all four siblings, held tightly in the center of their orbit. He carried a dog-eared comic book everywhere and brightened any room simply by entering it. The five children grew up in a simple world: a wooden porch, a gravel yard, an old hammock sagging beside the fence. Their life held no luxury, but it overflowed with laughter. They were the kind of family others hoped theirs might resemble one day. Many in town swear that whenever they saw the five walking down the main road, summer itself felt just a little longer. And it was that bond, their effortless, wholehearted love for one another, that made their disappearance a nightmare, not only for the Larkins, but for the entire community. Because everyone understood one thing: if something could take all five siblings at once, it was no ordinary tragedy. It was something capable of breaking the heart of a small town, one where people survived by holding on to each other. Long before the name Larkin became a scar across Manchester, the house itself carried a sorrow of its own, a story the older townspeople still speak of in lowered voices, as though afraid to stir what might be sleeping underneath. Every mystery tied to the place begins with Harold Merritt, the last man to own the house before he and his family vanished in the 1,950 seconds. Harold was not the sort of man who left bold marks on a town. He lived quietly with his wife and two children, working the fields, tending livestock, surviving on the labor of his hands. People remembered the weariness in his posture, as if he bore a burden heavier than the land he farmed. Knowing him was easy, understanding him was harder. He spoke little, And when he did, his words drifted into thoughts no one quite grasped. Some days he appeared at the sheriff's office reporting strange noises beneath his floor. "Footsteps," he claimed. Other times, the sound of children crying. Deputies inspected the house, tapped the floorboards, shined flashlights into the cellar, but found nothing beyond the familiar scent of damp earth. Folks assumed Harold was overwhelmed or spiraling under isolation. The reports were eventually filed away unresolved. But what townspeople remembered most wasn't the strange complaints. It was the years Harold spent secretly digging under the house. No one knew when he started. They only remembered seeing a faint glow of lantern light from beneath the floor, and hearing the thud of a hammer long past midnight. When neighbors asked what he was building, Harold simply said it was a shelter that when disaster came, he wanted his children safe. In those days, many feared war, storms, or famine. People prepared in their own ways. For Harold, preparation meant going down into the earth. He built rooms as small as bird cages, connected by tight corridors and metal trapdoors. No one knew where he learned such work or why he believed children needed spaces so narrow and closed in. These were not root cellars or storage rooms. They were dark, cold, and barely large enough for a child to sit. People said he was consumed by obsession. But obsession rarely starts by itself. It begins with a private fear no one else can see. One old neighbor recalled Harold saying something near the end, something both heartbreaking and haunting. "I just want to protect the children. I want them safe when the bad thing comes." But Harold's story did not end with the disaster he'd spent years preparing for. Instead, it ended with a disappearance no one could explain. One August morning in 1956, the Merritt family failed to show up for church. Neighbors knocked. No answer. Inside, the house was untouched, food on the table, clothes in the closet, but the family of 4 was gone, and the trapdoor to the underground rooms had been sealed with thick boards no one dared remove. Weeks later, police found Harold in the horse shed out back. He had died alone, without a note, without a clue to where his wife and children had gone. The town whispered about horrors under the floor, but no one dug deeper. Sometimes fear needs only a shadow to grow, and the Merritt house had far too many shadows. The town closed the house, closed the questions. Time drifted on. Stories faded into rumor. Dust settled over everything Harold built, but no one realized that his shelters, the trapdoors, the narrow passages, the strange mechanisms he believed would protect his children, still waited in the silent earth, waiting, holding their breath. No one knew that 3 generations later, they would become the trigger for another tragedy, one far heavier, far darker than anything Manchester had ever imagined. The Merritt house wasn't simply abandoned. It was left behind with its fears and its secrets still alive beneath the floorboards. July 12, 1986, began like any ordinary summer day in eastern Kentucky. The heat shimmered over the road in waves, and the cicadas were so loud they felt like a blanket of sound stretched across the hills. In the small wooden Larkin house, the 5 siblings were getting ready for a trip the town would never forget. A simple adventure, harmless on its surface. They wanted to explore the Merritt house, abandoned long before any of them were born. That afternoon, when the old blue Chevy pickup rumbled out of the yard, their neighbor, Alma Greer, was watering her flowers. She heard the engine before she saw the truck turning at the bend. 5 young faces crowded the front seat. Rachel leaned out and smiled at Alma. David waved his hand outside the window. The radio was playing an old WCT summer tune, one the whole town knew by heart. It was a quick, ordinary moment, light as a breath. But Alma would carry that image for the rest of her life, replaying it on every hot day when the dirt road kicked up dust like memory. The Merritt place was only 7 miles from the Larkins' farm. But it was 7 miles that separated town from a patch of land people avoided. The road into the old property was narrow and rough, lined by trees so dense they cast shadows even under the harsh sun. Locals used to say that the moment you stepped onto that land, the air changed heavier, quieter, as though even the wind refused to pass through. When the children arrived, daylight still blazed bright. Wild grass stretched across the fields, and the Merritt house stood there aged, but not completely collapsed. Broken windows, a sagging porch, a roof stripped by storms, exposing beams bleached to gray. No one had crossed its doorstep in decades. That summer, the Larkin siblings were the first. No one saw them climb out of the truck. No one heard what they said as they approached the porch. Only the scene hours later could tell what happened next. When the Larkins realized dusk had settled and the children hadn't come home, they began calling neighbors. Not one had seen the siblings after the truck passed Alma's house. A chill ran through their mother, a deep, wordless feeling, as though an unseen door had just closed. At 9:30 p.m., the police were notified. Within an hour, they found the Chevy, parked beneath the limbs of an old willow at the edge of the Merritt property. Headlights off. Driver's door open just a crack. Keys still in the ignition. What unsettled the officers wasn't the abandoned truck. It was the sound coming from the radio. A faint, steady hiss, like the breath of something that had lived too long in the dark. There were no signs of struggle, no scattered belongings, no footprints running away. The night was windless, but the driver's door rocked ever so slightly, as if someone had stepped away only seconds before. Behind the house, under the back porch, officers found a small shoe. Dust-coated but oddly clean around the laces, placed neatly as though someone had bent down and set it there on purpose. Not dropped, not lost, more like a message than a clue. Inside, the floorboards groaned beneath their weight. In the living room, a rocking chair faced the window, still turned at an angle, as though someone had stood up abruptly at the sound of visitors. In the kitchen, moisture on the cracked glass pane revealed a small handprint, thin fingers pressed into the dust, as if someone had tried to push outward and couldn't. Officers called the children's names. Their voices echoed, then fell into a silence that felt wrong, so thick and deliberate that even the calmest man could feel dread rising in his chest. It wasn't the silence of an empty house. It was the silence of a place holding too much. In the backyard, the K-9 units traced all 5 children's scents, but only to a single point. The trail ended abruptly, vanishing after 50 yards, as if the children had stood there and stepped into nothing. The first night closed with more questions than answers. The truck was there, the shoe was there, the handprint was there, but the Larkin 5 were not. As darkness settled over the Merritt house near midnight, a chill moved through everyone present, as if they were standing at the edge of something enormous and unseen, a moment that had happened only hours before but already felt impossibly far away. Years later, one of the officers admitted he felt the house was waiting that night. Waiting for the right question. Waiting for someone to look in the right place. But all they could do in that moment was shine their flashlights into the emptiness and hope that one of the names they called would be answered. None were. Only the soft hiss of static from the Chevy's radio remained, pulsing through the dark, proof that the 5 children had truly been there, and a reminder that no one knew what happened after that final sign of life. By the next morning, as the first light slid across the tin rooftops of Manchester, news of the missing Larkin children had swept through the town like wind rolling over the hills. People who were halfway through brewing their coffee, who were heading out to the fields, who were just opening the doors of their shops, every one of them froze the moment they heard the name. In a town this small, there are names that need no explanation. Larkin was one of them. By 7 a.m., the area around the Merritt house was so crowded, there was barely room to park. Patrol cars lined up in rows. Pickup trucks belonging to local farmers arrived, piled with flashlights, ropes, water jugs. Older men who mostly hunted or knew the land better than their own living rooms, strapped on headlamps. The women from the church brought biscuits and hot coffee to keep everyone going. By mid-morning, nearly 300 volunteers had gathered. 300 hearts clinging to the same thin hope that the 5 children were somewhere out there, waiting to be found. Helicopters arrived from the neighboring county. Their blades cut the air with a fierce, anxious rhythm. Every time they passed over the thick woods behind the Merritt place, the people on the ground looked up, their breaths hitched. They wanted a miracle. They wanted to believe the children were standing beneath some shaded clearing, waving for help. K-9 units came in from 3 counties. Dogs that had tracked lost hikers, flood survivors, fugitives. But here, every one of them led officers to the same point about 50 meters beyond the Merritt porch before stopping cold. Then the scent vanished. Gone, like the air itself had been wiped clean. A young deputy later said that when his dog reached that exact spot, the animal simply froze. It didn't growl or panic. It just stood still, then slowly backed away, lifting its head toward the tree line without choosing a direction, like it sensed something the rest of them couldn't. Even in the burning July heat, the deputy felt a chill slide down his back. For 3 days, search teams combed every inch of land. They waded through marshes, sliced through thorned underbrush, checked cracks in the hillside. One team even went down abandoned wells. Some were mildly injured. Others collapsed from exhaustion. But no one quit. The missing weren't strangers. They were neighbors' children. Friends' children. Children who sat in the pews of the same church. The Larkin family set up a small search station near the fence of the Merritt property. Their mother, Darlene, sat there from dawn to dusk, clutching the youngest boy's handkerchief. She didn't cry, not because she didn't hurt, but because her grief had reached a place beyond sound. People passing by lowered their eyes, swallowed their own emotions. Beside her, Frank Larkin tried to stay steady, though his eyes were always red. He didn't speak much, but each time a search team returned, he straightened as if one more step might bring news he needed like air. But good news never came. They found a few old footprints. A tire track later confirmed to belong to a farmer's truck. Some broken porch wood from the Merritt house. Nothing belonging to the children. The timeline made things worse. If the children had been hurt, there should have been signs. If they'd been taken, their vehicle would have moved. If they'd wandered into the woods, the dogs would have followed. But everything, every trace, every possibility stopped at the boundary of the Merritt property, as if the land itself swallowed every clue. By the 4th day, as helicopters pulled away and the late-day sun dipped behind the flags at the command post, even the strongest among them began exchanging weary looks. They didn't say the words, but the same feeling sat heavy on every chest. Helplessness, as if they were running in a perfect circle they couldn't break. Sheriff Wayne Copley, with more than 2 decades of experience, stood on the Merritt porch each night. He'd look across the gold-tinted horizon, then toward the vast, unmoving field behind the house. He had handled tragedies before. He had seen loss, fear, cruelty, but he had never seen a disappearance so silent. No noise, no movement, no path forward, just a void that felt like lead in his hands. On the 5th night, the wind picked up with a sharpness to it, carrying the scent of dry grass and earth rising from underground. Copley stood on the porch, staring at the broken doorway, the rocking chair still turned toward the window. He lit a cigarette and, after a long drag, murmured to his deputy, "Something's wrong here. I can't say what it is, but something out here doesn't want us finding them." It wasn't fear-mongering. It was the instinct of a man who had lived too long with truth and tragedy to ignore what his bones were telling him. By the 6th night, when the last beam of a flashlight skimmed over the backyard of the Merritt place, Copley knew the search couldn't end. But he also knew that whatever he was fighting wasn't just time. It was a silence born of the earth. A silence hiding something deeper, darker, and older than any of them could yet comprehend. As the search crossed into its 2nd week with no progress, Manchester fell into a strange state. Part fear, part sorrow, part quiet unraveling. Conversations at the market became hushed. Men at the morning diner stared out the windows longer than they ate. No one wanted to admit it, but hope was bleeding out hour by hour. Then the leads started coming in. Not the kind that solved cases, the kind that haunted them. The first came from a passing truck driver. He swore he'd seen the 5 children walking near a wooded stretch 3 miles from the Merritt place. He even described Matthew's shirt. But when officers checked the area, nothing made sense. The timing, the direction, the distance. No footprints matched. The report was logged, but belief was harder to muster. The second lead muddied things further. A woman from the next town called, claiming she'd seen the children that same evening near an old storage shed. She described them as lost, confused. Officers investigated. The shed existed. The ground did show signs someone had stood there, but nothing connected to the Larkin kids. Under questioning, The woman changed her timeline. Her story dissolved into rumor. Then came the third lead, the one that would haunt Manchester for years. A teenage boy who lived near the southern fields said that on the night of the disappearance, he saw a faint yellow light flicker in the second-story window of the Merritt house. Just for a second or two, then gone. He thought someone was inside, maybe the children, maybe a stranger. But the detail that shook everyone was this. He claimed he saw a figure standing at that window, tall, motionless, facing outward as if watching. Officers swept the house again. There was no electricity. The nearest power line had been dead for decades. No generator. No working bulb. The second floor was so decayed even sunlight leaked directly through the roof. There was no natural way a light could have appeared that night. Still, the boy insisted. No, it wasn't headlights. No, it wasn't the moon. Just a single yellow glow, like someone turning on a lamp and turning it off again. Rumors bloomed like wildfire. Some said it was a signal for help. Some said someone had been living in the house. Others whispered the old stories of Harold Merritt, the footsteps, the voices, the children he swore he heard beneath the floorboards. One rumor fed the next, until the whole town seemed to breathe uneasily. But the most unsettling discovery didn't come from outside. It came from inside the Merritt house. On the second floor, in a cramped room where wallpaper peeled like old skin, an investigator pulled a fallen cabinet away from the wall and froze. Carved into the wood were 5 names: Rachel, David, Emma, Eli, Matthew. Names etched hastily unfinished, like whoever carved them was interrupted. At first, the team thought they'd found a breakthrough. But when samples were analyzed, the truth chilled them. The carvings were decades old. Long before 1986. Long before the Larkin children were even born. Dating back to Harold Merritt's time. How could those 5 names already be there? No one had an answer. The question itself deepened the dread. In the end, every lead, every story, every eerie sign evaporated. Just when officers thought they were brushing up against truth, it dissolved into mist. The investigation drifted in circles until Sheriff Copley quietly told his deputy, "I don't know what's happening, but it feels like we're chasing our own shadow." Manchester began to accept what no one wanted to speak aloud. This case wasn't like the others. No clear path, no logical chain, only ghost stories, fading memories, inexplicable details, and a house that stood silent and ruined, yet somehow aware. As summer waned, the Larkins' hope thinned into a single habit. Their mother looking up each time a vehicle passed on the dirt road. Every engine made her rise to her feet, caught between dread and desperate hope. Because some days, the deepest pain isn't loss. It's living with a question that refuses to answer. Time has a way of softening tragedies. It dulls the noise, erases the tracks. But with the disappearance of the Larkin 5, time didn't heal anything. It only pushed people onto different roads, each carrying a weighted piece of the story that never found its ending. The Larkin family left Manchester the following spring. No farewell gathering, no announcement, just a quiet loading of boxes into an aging car, the closing of their front door one last time, and a kitchen left behind where Rachel's apron still hung on its nail. Darlene, their mother, had tried to stay. She believed if she kept dinner ready at 6, if she left the porch light on every night, if she cracked open the kitchen window before dusk, then maybe her children would find their way home. But months of living inside that breathless waiting hollowed her out. Eventually, she no longer had the strength to stand in the doorway and pretend hope could be summoned by routine. Some say on the final night before they left, she stood in the empty room with her palm pressed gently to the wall, as if touching each of her missing children one more time. She left a note for the neighbor she trusted most. It held only one line: "If there's news, any news, please find us." Frank, their father, spoke even less. He tried to look strong, but after that summer, he never sat in the porch rocker again. The chair where he once read the paper every afternoon sat abandoned, slowly gathering dust like a monument to a life that had stopped mid-breath. Manchester, after the initial upheaval, had to keep going. People had to work, had to raise families, had to live, even with something unbearable lodged in the town's throat. The Larkin story became something spoken of when the weather turned hot again. Then, slowly, it faded from daily talk. Not gone, just tucked into the folds of the town's collective memory. Some remembered it clearly, others only in the blurred way one recalls an old nightmare. The Merritt house remained, a dark silhouette on the edge of town. Brush grew thick around it. The roof sagged a little more each year. Wind slipped through the warped boards and made small sounds that people told themselves belonged to the woods, not the house. No one went inside anymore. The place carried a silence too heavy to step through. No one wanted to face the cold truth buried somewhere beneath its floor. And so, with each passing year, the house disappeared a little further, as if the town hoped it might decay into nothing, taking the heartache with it. But one man never forgot. Couldn't forget. Sheriff Wayne Copley, who had led the search in 1986, carried that case like a shadow dragging behind him across decades. Even after the investigation closed, he kept the file on his desk. Every summer, he opened it again, reading page after page. There were nights he sat alone in his office, the only sound the soft tap of his pen against the wood. He reviewed search maps, call logs, photographs of the Merritt property, not because he believed he'd discover something new, but because the idea of putting it away felt unbearable. His wife said he sometimes woke in the middle of the night and walked downstairs without a word. She never followed. She knew some burdens couldn't be shared. More than once, she found him hours later staring at the faded photograph of the Merritt house. He didn't cry or speak. He simply looked, as though the picture might one day give up its secrets out of mercy. Copley trusted instinct more than experience, and instinct whispered the same thing for years. The truth wasn't in the woods. It wasn't in the river or the abandoned coal pits. It was in the Merritt house, the house he had walked through dozens, maybe hundreds of times, the house he studied more than any place in his career. But no matter how sharp his intuition, he never found the key to unlock what lay beneath it. The years kept moving. Children grew up hearing the story like an old legend. Adults learned to look at the abandoned property the way one looks at a healed-over wound that still aches whenever the weather changes. When Copley finally retired, he carried the case file home in his old leather briefcase. He placed it in a drawer beneath the window that looked out onto his backyard. Someone once asked why he didn't put it away for good. He only said, "Some stories don't let you walk away." And so, 33 years later, when the winter wind of 2019 swept through the brittle pines, the 84-year-old man still turned his head whenever someone mentioned the Merritt land. Somewhere deep inside him lingered a small, stubborn thought. Maybe the earth would speak one day. Maybe it had simply been waiting for the right moment. He didn't know that moment was now closer than ever. When Rachel and Thomas Alden signed the papers for the Merritt property in late 2018, they weren't buying a house. They were buying a dream. A dream of a small Kentucky place where they could rebuild after years that had worn them thin. To them, the old structure was just wood and nails in need of love. They had no idea what time had been storing underneath it. During the first month, they did what any young couple would: cleaned, scrubbed, replaced rotten boards. With every square foot cleared, they imagined their future inn. A place where guests might sit on the porch and listen to crickets under the soft green sweep of the hills. But within weeks, the house began to change, not in ways they could explain. It started with the smell, a scent that defied naming. Not mold, not the sharp rot of a dead mouse. It carried a faint sweetness, mixed with the warm undertone of earth, like something rising from a place sealed too long. It drifted through the kitchen at dawn, strongest when the weather shifted. Thomas pulled up floor mats, checked plumbing, replaced entire sections of pipe. The smell always came back. Then, small items began to vanish. Not valuables, just ordinary things but gone in ways too strange to ignore. A new hammer, a box of nails left on the counter, a dish towel Rachel set down one evening only to find missing by morning. Every time something disappeared, Thomas tried to rationalize. They were renovating. Tools were everywhere. They were stressed, but excuses grew thin when items vanished overnight after being placed intentionally in sight. Even their dog, Scout, a gentle golden retriever, changed. Once playful and curious, she became wary, skittish. Whenever Thomas opened the narrow door leading to the basement, Scout froze, then backed away. Fur raised, a low whine in her throat. Thomas once tried coaxing her down the steps. She barked sharply, then bolted, hiding behind Rachel as though seeking refuge. They chalked it up to a new environment, at least at first. Then came the morning in December when unease turned into certainty. Rachel stepped into the kitchen and felt the floor dip under her foot, not with the softness of rotted wood, but with a hollow reverberation. As if something beneath had shifted, she pressed down again. A faint echo rose from below. Thomas tapped the floor with the end of a broom handle. The sound that answered was unmistakable. Not earth, but open air. That afternoon, they removed a section of flooring. They expected moisture damage or a sinkhole. Instead, they found something else entirely. A patch of rough concrete, thick and uneven, poured hastily and without care, as though someone had wanted to hide something, not strengthen the foundation. At its center was a dull, circular outline. Metal. The rim of a hatch buried so long it had nearly fused with the concrete. Rachel stared at it, her hand trembling slightly. Thomas swallowed hard, trying not to reveal his own unease. Whatever this was, it wasn't on the blueprints. It wasn't in any property history. No one had ever mentioned it. The next day, Thomas brought home a concrete saw. They needed to open the hatch, not out of curiosity, but because the fear of not knowing had become heavier than whatever truth waited below. The blade screeched against the cement. Dust floated like pale smoke in the winter light. Piece by piece, the patch broke away. Then came a soft pop, a release of pressure, like a sealed room letting out its breath. Cold air rushed upward, not winter cold, but the cold of something ancient, trapped, carrying the scent of old soil, and something unnamed. Thomas shone his flashlight downward. A narrow stone stairway led into darkness. Limestone walls, damp and rough, droplets clinging like sweat. Rachel stepped back, her heartbeat slowing in a way that felt primal, instinctual, as though her body recognized danger before her mind did. Thomas descended 3 steps before stopping. His beam caught wooden shelves, cloudy jars, and a darkness beyond that absorbed light instead of reflecting it. He came back up too quickly. Far too quickly for a man who'd insisted he wasn't afraid. That evening, they understood something they hadn't before. The strange smell, the missing objects, the hollow beneath the floor. None of it was random. The house had been trying to speak to them from the beginning. They just hadn't known the language, and they didn't yet realize that what they'd uncovered was only the surface. Beneath it lay something else, something that had waited 33 years for the chance to rise into the light. 2 days after the hatch was uncovered, county investigators entered the Merritt house. As their floodlights swung toward the exposed basement doorway, the little kitchen fell into an uncanny stillness. No wind at the windows, no creaking of settling wood. It was as if the house was holding its breath. Watching them descend, Thomas and Rachel stood back, not daring to come closer. They simply watched the strangers in gloves step down the stone stairs, boots stirring the dense dust of decades. No one spoke. Flashlight beams swept across limestone walls, across corners so untouched, they felt almost preserved, like a room time itself had forgotten to disturb. Then one of the lights stopped. A soft, breath-thin voice followed. "There's something here." On the packed earth floor, half buried beneath crumbs of soil, lay objects so small and simple that at first glance they might have been dismissed as junk. But every person in that basement understood instantly. These things did not belong to the present. They carried a quiet grief, the aching sense of something once held, once cherished, then lost. The first item lifted from the soil was a silver necklace. The oval pendant was cracked clean through. Even through the tarnish, the faint engraving of a flower could still be seen. Rachel Larkin had worn it every day. A birthday gift. A memory from a 19-year-old life that had never been allowed to unfold. Beside it lay a pair of small round glasses, the metal bent, the lenses caked with dirt. Everyone knew whose they were. Eli, the thoughtful twin. The reader. The observer who saw the world through frames slightly too big for his face. A few inches away, another item emerged. A belt buckle, rusted but still bearing the shape of a tiny star. David's, 17 and trying so hard to look older, to seem steady for his younger siblings. Then came the thing that changed the temperature of the entire room. A red children's wristwatch. The glass was cracked. The band was faded, and both hands, hour and minute, were frozen at the exact same place. 3:17. No one spoke as the flashlight caught its face. Time had stopped inside that watch. A specific moment. A moment that must have witnessed something none of them could name. And finally, resting on the edge of a small rock, was a shoe. Tiny. Too tiny to belong to anyone but Matthew, the youngest. The boy who ran through fields until he lost so many shoes his mother kept spare pairs by the door. The shoe was coated in dust, but the laces were strangely clean, as though someone had set it down with uncharacteristic gentleness. The investigators stood motionless for a long time, not because they were unfamiliar with evidence, but because they understood this was no longer evidence. This was the answer the town had been waiting 33 years to receive, and it was heavier than any of them had been prepared for. One older officer picked up the watch, his hand trembling. He had been part of the original 1986 search. He had grown old since then, hair gray, shoulders stooped, but the memory of the Larkin children running across their farmyard had never dimmed. He stared at the frozen hands on the dial. He swallowed hard, his voice caught somewhere deep. "They were here," he whispered. "Right under our feet all this time." Upstairs, Rachel Alden covered her mouth. She hadn't known the Larkins, hadn't lived through the summer of their disappearance. Yet in that moment she felt the same sting that had once settled over an entire community. The shattering of something innocent, something that should have belonged to warm July afternoons but had been buried in this darkness instead. Thomas turned away, bracing a hand on the counter. He didn't look down again, not out of fear, but out of the quiet, aching awareness that what they'd found was the final echo of a goodbye no one had been allowed to say. One by one, the items were photographed, tagged, and placed in evidence bags. But no investigator saw them as mere objects anymore. Each carried a story, a small hand that once held it, a fleeting moment of childhood that had been carried into the dark, and together, they pointed to the same truth. The children had been here. They hadn't run away, hadn't wandered off, hadn't vanished into the woods. They'd been kept here, and time itself had stopped with them. A new question rose, heavy as stone. Who placed these items here? Who closed this hatch? Who froze time at 3:17? That question would change the direction of the entire investigation, leading them into a deeper layer of truth, one even the earth of the Merritt house had tried to hide for decades. Once the children's belongings were collected, investigators knew the basement held far more than what they had seen. They called in geological surveyors, who scanned the ground beneath the house. When the radar swept beneath the stone, a second cavity appeared, larger, deeper, shaped like a long-sealed heart of the earth. No one said it aloud, but every person in the room felt the same dread settle over them. The next morning, the digging began. Not with machinery, but carefully, by hand. Any heavy tool risked disturbing what lay below. Layers of dirt fell away, then crumbled stone. When a thin shaft finally opened and a flashlight slipped through, a wave of cold air poured out. Dense, stale, crushing. Flashlight beams lowered through the gap. A soft exhale, a gasp, a whispered curse. At the bottom of the cavity, there lay what no one wished to find. 5 small skeletons, side by side, not scattered, not collapsed in chaos. Arranged as if in their final moments they had held on to one another, a fragile circle of protection against the dark. The room fell silent, utterly, painfully silent. The lead forensic examiner knelt, lowering the light. "Their children," he murmured, as if the earth itself might shatter if he spoke louder. All 5. The smallest lay in the center. 2 larger skeletons curved as though shielding it. Another faced upward, toward the hatch above, as if it had looked to the last slit of sky until the very end. One had both hands clenched tight, as if holding on to a hope that never came. Veteran officers looked away. One wiped his glasses. Another leaned against the stone wall, shaking. Because they understood. They were looking at the final hours of children the whole town had searched for, standing unknowingly just feet above them. As forensic archaeologists documented the scene, a disturbing detail emerged. There were no signs of struggle, no shattered bones, no violent trauma. They had not been killed by a person. They had been trapped. Attention turned to the structure itself. How had the space sealed? Why was there no exit? Why had no one heard them? Then, on the east wall, they found it. A collapsed wooden mechanism, rough but ingeniously simple. A weight-triggered trapdoor system, built by Harold Merritt, not out of cruelty, but out of fear, an attempt, in his own twisted logic, to protect his children from disaster. When pressure hit the wrong step, the upper hatch would fall shut. When someone descended too far, the stone slab above the lower chamber would slide into place. Both could only be opened from the outside. Only from the outside. When investigators realized this, they turned back toward the skeletons. The truth was devastating. The children had never had a chance. No cries would have reached the surface. No pounding could echo up through the sealed stone. Above them, in the summer of 1986, search parties had stood mere feet away, without the faintest idea the children were dying underneath their boots. A preliminary briefing was given right there, in the dim light of the cavern. No external trauma, no foul play. The cause of death was the chamber itself. Air thinning. Carbon levels rising. Darkness closing in. A young investigator pressed his back to the wall, staring upward. "All those years," he whispered. "We were right on top of them. We were standing right on top of them." His words flattened the room into silence. It wasn't just an observation. It was an indictment. Against fate. Against time. Against the hopelessness of a search doomed from its very first day. When the chamber was fully documented, Sheriff Wayne Copley, now old, his hands unsteady, was brought to the site. He stepped forward, leaning on his cane. He looked down, at the marked positions, at the outlines, at the truth 33 years late. His lips pressed thin, his eyes shone. Then, quietly, he said the sentence every investigator would remember for the rest of their lives. "The terrible thing isn't that we lost them, it's that we never heard them." The chamber was covered again, the lights fading to darkness. But for a brief, trembling moment, everyone standing inside the Merritt house felt something shift. Not fear, not dread, but the solemn weight of a final plea finally reaching the light. A plea that had waited 33 years beneath the earth. As investigators pushed deeper into the second chamber, the name Harold Merritt rose again. A shadow time itself had never successfully buried. And to understand why this house had held its secrets for decades, they had to return to the life of the man who built the underground maze he truly believed would save his family from a disaster only he could see coming. Harold Merritt was born and raised among the rolling hills of eastern Kentucky, a gentle, quiet man whose view of the world always seemed tilted a few degrees off-center. He farmed. He fixed things. He lived simply with his wife and 2 young children. But after a violent storm swept through in the early 1952s, neighbors began whispering that Harold was no longer quite the same. He startled at small noises. He paused mid-sentence to listen for things no one else heard. And he spoke softly, earnestly about the end of the world in a way that made people both pity him and fear for him. Some believed he had read too many war reports in the paper. Others thought the string of bad harvests had pushed him too far. But whatever Harold believed, he believed with his entire being. He started keeping a journal, pages filled with signs only he could sense. Hairline fractures in the air, a low rumbling beneath the floorboards at night, and the most haunting of all, what he described as the voices of children beneath the earth, calling out as if begging to be saved. Today, doctors would call it paranoia, a delusional disorder where fear becomes a lens, reshaping the world around it. But back then, no one had the words. They only watched as Harold began to dig. He dug under the house, under the barn, under the feed shed. By day and by lantern light at night, Harold believed that when catastrophe struck, underground shelters would be the only safe place left. In his mind, digging was love. Digging was protection. Digging was the only thing he could do to keep his family alive. The first chambers were crude holes in the dirt, but over time they became limestone rooms, small, meticulously carved, reinforced with heavy beams, fitted with trapdoors and weight trigger systems. Designs no one in rural Kentucky had ever imagined, more reminiscent of Cold War survival manuals than a farmer's imagination. Harold built them not out of malice, but out of devotion warped by fear. Yet the house began to change around him. The noises he believed he heard deepened his sleeplessness. The glances from neighbors made him retreat, and the creeping suspicion that the world was unraveling left him unable to trust even the ground beneath his feet. His wife begged him to stop, to leave, to take their children somewhere brighter, somewhere safer. Harold only shook his head. "I'm trying to save us," he said. "You don't understand." Then came one quiet summer night in 1956. Neighbors noticed the Merritt home was strangely still. No lights, no movement, no sound of children. When police forced entry, everything was untouched. Beds made, clothes folded, dinner ingredients waiting on the counter. But the family of 4 was gone. Weeks later, Harold was found in the horse shed behind the house. No note, no explanation. Only his journal lying open to a damp, smudged final page. "They're safe now. I brought them below." Those words haunted the county for decades. No one knew whom he had taken below, or what had happened in the final nights of the Merritt family. No one wanted to know. The house was sealed, the land abandoned. Fear packed itself into silence. Memory slowly softened, and Harold's underground shelters, those strange stone rooms carved out of love and madness, remained buried, untouched. Like old wounds the earth wasn't ready to expose. When the Larkin children vanished in the summer of 1986, people briefly recalled Harold's stories. The voices beneath the floor, the strange trapdoor, the warnings no one had taken seriously. But by then, it was far too late. The town searched everywhere except the one place Harold had built to be invisible. When investigators in 2019 reviewed old medical records, they confirmed that Harold had suffered a severe paranoid disorder. He feared unseen dangers. He believed in threats nobody else could hear. And in trying to protect his family, he had created the very trap that consumed them. As investigators read the final line in Harold's journal, the room went still for a long, heavy moment, not out of fear, but because the sentence carried a loneliness so profound that anyone could feel its ache. Harold wasn't a monster. He was a father lost inside his own terror, a man the town didn't know how to help, a man whose love became a labyrinth, one that swallowed his family and, decades later, 5 innocent children who never even knew his name. When the Merritt house was finally cleared for investigation, a young detective said something that made everyone pause. Maybe the saddest part is, he really thought he was keeping everyone safe. He didn't know he was building something else. And in that moment, inside the broken, drafty shell of the Merritt house, a quiet sorrow settled over the team. A sorrow for Harold Merritt, a man who turned fear into destiny. A destiny that stretched more than 60 years, and buried 2 generations. Beneath the silence of the earth, when the 5 sets of remains were brought out of the chamber and transported to the state forensic lab, the town of Manchester fell into a silence heavier than any winter it had ever known. People waited for the results, though no one could say what they were hoping for. Part of them wanted a final answer. Another part feared that answer would sharpen an old grief rather than soothe it. The forensic report arrived in early March, a thick document, quiet, clinical, yet crushing in its weight. There was no killer, no sign of violence, no evidence of struggle, coercion, or threat. Instead, the truth was simpler and far more brutal. This was not a homicide. It was an accident born from time's slow decay, from a shelter system Harold Merritt built out of his own fear, and from a single, unforeseeable moment that changed everything. According to the medical examiner, the wooden flooring above the first chamber had weakened after decades of rot. When the 5 children stepped inside and unknowingly placed their weight on the trapdoor's stress point, the mechanism engaged. The hatch dropped. The soil and debris above it slid into place, sealing the entrance instantly. The chamber below became a closed room, no escape, no passage for sound to reach the surface. No one dragged them down. No human hand locked them in. It was time, gravity, and the remnants of a system built by a frightened father more than 30 years earlier. There were no signs of a fight, no panicked claw marks, no trauma, only oxygen levels that had slowly thinned, and carbon monoxide that had risen hour by hour. An invisible fog settling into the small, cold space. The report concluded that the children were conscious during the early hours. They may have called each other's names. They may have tried to reassure one another. And in the end, they likely sat together close, touching exactly as investigators found them. The way they rested spoke louder than any testimony. Not scattered, not desperate, just 5 siblings holding on to each other, the way they always had. A truth so tender and devastating that even the forensic team paused multiple times while writing the report. When the final results were presented to the Larkin family, the mother did not cry. Her tears had dried decades ago. She simply placed her hand on the report, her fingers trembling slightly, and asked in a voice as soft as wind, "They didn't suffer much, did they?" The officers had no perfect answer, but they told her the truest thing they could. In their last moments, they were together. For the town, the report was more than the conclusion of a 33-year search. It opened 2 separate doors of emotion. The first was relief. There was no lurking monster, no evil stranger, no hidden crime haunting their years. The second was heartbreak, because the world didn't need cruelty to create this tragedy. All it took was a rotted plank, an old mechanism, and one unintended step. A veteran medical examiner said something the press would later repeat. This is the kind of truth that lifts a burden and doubles the pain, because there's no one to blame, no one to punish, and so the sorrow stays forever. When the news swept through Manchester, people stood on their porches for long minutes, not speaking, not asking, just looking toward the fields where the Merritt House once stood, as if staring into a hollow carved by decades of grief. Sheriff Wayne Copley, though retired for many years, was among the first called. He listened to the findings quietly, hands resting on his knees. He didn't blame himself, but his eyes sank under the weight of 33 years of what-ifs. He let out a long breath, one shaped by a lifetime of searching for answers that had been beneath his feet all along. When he finally rose, he said only one sentence. Accident or not, we left them down there far too long. Everyone in the room lowered their heads, not out of guilt, but because the words were true, painfully, unavoidably true. Sometimes justice doesn't come to punish. Sometimes it comes to remind us how fragile childhood is, how fragile life is, and how quickly the world can turn on a single, ordinary moment. A moment no one could have predicted, but everyone would regret forever. When the forensic report was officially released, a quiet haze settled over Manchester. Not the hush of fear, not the hush of confusion, but the kind of silence that comes when a long-buried grief finally takes shape. The Larkin family was notified a few days before the public. People said that morning, Darlene Larkin sat in a small room inside the sheriff's office, her fingers clutching the hem of the old sweater she always carried. She no longer cried the way she had in '86. A mother's tears eventually learned to stay inside, gathering like thin mist at the corner of the eyes, pain the body has chosen to hold rather than release. When she heard the conclusion, an accident, she nodded slowly. No protest, no questions, only a quiet whisper. So, they weren't afraid. They had each other to the end. Frank Larkin, the man who had kept a porch light burning for a full year after the children vanished, clenched his hands until his knuckles turned white. He said nothing. But everyone present, officers young and old, saw the moment his shoulders fell. A father who had spent 33 years searching finally knew the truth. But the truth brought no peace. It simply opened a new door to a loss he had tried for decades to lock away. As for former Sheriff Wayne Copley, who had led the search in 1986, the news seemed to age him in a single afternoon. He sat alone in his old pickup truck, parked in the yard, staring out toward the same roads that once carried him from one false lead to another. Neighbors later said they saw him lift a hand to his forehead, as though the weight of it all had become too much. He had always believed something had been missed. Now he knew he'd been right. The children had been beneath his feet. Inside a house he'd entered 3 times. In shadows his flashlight had swept across, without ever knowing what lay below. But he did not blame himself. He simply wondered. If he'd paused a little longer, listened a little harder, would he have heard anything rising from the earth? No one could answer that. Not even him. He held the truth in his trembling hands like an old memory he wished he could forget but knew he never would. The town of Manchester, which had once woven the Larkin children's story into a kind of sorrowful folklore, reacted in the most human way possible. Not with noise, not with chaos, but with small gestures, gentle as breath. People left 5 bouquets along the old wooden fence where the truck had been found decades earlier. Some tied white ribbons to the maple tree outside the church. Parents told their children to come home before dark, not out of fear, but out of the tenderness that follows a lesson learned too late. A small memorial was held in the town church. No cameras, no reporters, just the people who had lived 33 years beneath the weight of a hanging question. When the pastor read each child's name, the wind outside brushed the windows soft, like a reminder that those names had never truly left the soil. A former teacher, who had taught Emma and Eli, stood to speak. She told the room she had kept their final essays for 3 decades. I always felt they were still out there somewhere, she said. Now I can let them rest. The room fell silent, not heavy, just understanding. And in the days that followed, something unusual happened. Manchester, a town that had once avoided the Merritt property as though it were cursed, grew strangely calm when passing by. People no longer saw it as a haunted place. They saw it as a page of local history, a wrinkle in time, a reminder that not all tragedies are born of malice. Some come from neglect, decay, and the things we forget to care for. When the demolition crew came to clear the last of the foundation, a small crowd gathered at a distance. No one spoke. But when the final wall came down, they all bowed their heads at once, as though they were saying goodbye not only to a house, but to a sorrow that had lived beneath the ground for more than 30 years. And when the dust rose from the crumbling stone, it felt as though Manchester finally exhaled, not in relief, but in grief, gratitude, and the quiet understanding that truth does not heal everything. Sometimes it simply lets people move forward. Some pieces of land carry a silence heavier than time itself, not emptiness, but a long, restrained breath waiting to be released, whether in pain or in peace. The ground where the Merritt House once stood was one of those places, unremarkable, unadorned, yet holding more stories than any person had lived long enough to tell. When the house was finally torn down and the last of its foundation leveled, people were surprised by what remained. The land wasn't eerie, it wasn't cursed, it was simply quiet, a gentle, earned quiet, as though the earth had waited too long to be relieved of the secrets it had been forced to keep. Neighbors said the afternoons grew warmer after that. The wind softened as it passed through the trees, and no one heard the strange creaks and murmurs they'd once blamed on the old house. The ground had given back what it held, and for the first time in decades, it felt light. But that quiet carried a lesson. People began to understand that humans only see the surface of things. We see a collapsing house, a missing persons case, an unsolved mystery. But beneath our feet, there may be another world, layers of history no one remembers, errors from the past covered in dust, mechanisms long abandoned, a frightened father's attempt at protection that became another family's fate. The earth does not speak, but it remembers. It holds footsteps, it holds whispers, it holds the last moments of children huddled together in a darkness they could not comprehend. The most haunting truth was not that the mystery had been solved, but that beneath the soles of thousands of shoes, beneath decades of grass and frost and summer rain, 5 children had once sat together in silence, waiting for adults who never realized where to look. For many in Manchester, the lasting truth was not the tragedy itself. It was the reminder of how fragile life can be, how quietly things can break, how easily something old and forgotten can shift the world forever. On the final day of the memorial services, a young boy stared out at the empty field and asked his mother, "Does the earth get sad if it keeps secrets?" She placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "Every place has its stories. Not all of them are sad, but all of them want to be heard." The pastor smiled when he overheard it, because it captured something most adults take a lifetime to understand. The earth doesn't talk, but it tells stories through what it keeps, through forgotten tunnels, through sealed rooms, through the silences we walk over every day. And that silence is why the story of the Larkin Five became something the town chose never to forget, not to haunt themselves, but to remember that tragedy does not always wear the face of evil. Sometimes it's just time, decay, and the frailty of things we assume will last. The earth held those children for more than 3 decades, and when the truth finally rose to the surface, it felt as though the ground itself eased. No longer heavy, no longer burdened. Just a field again, letting the wind pass freely. But for those who know the story, each time they walk by, they pause. Not to listen for a sound, but to honor what lies beneath the surface of every life. The truth that the most important things are often hidden under the quietest ground. Some pieces of land carry a silence heavier than time itself. Not emptiness, but a long, restrained breath waiting to be released, whether in pain or in peace. The ground where the Merritt House once stood was one of those places, unremarkable, unadorned, yet holding more stories than any person had lived long enough to tell. When the house was finally torn down and the last of its foundation leveled, people were surprised by what remained. The land wasn't eerie, it wasn't cursed, it was simply quiet, a gentle, earned quiet, as though the earth had waited too long to be relieved of the secrets it had been forced to keep. Neighbors said the afternoons grew warmer after that. The wind softened as it passed through the trees, and no one heard the strange creaks and murmurs they'd once blamed on the old house. The ground had given back what it held, and for the first time in decades, it felt light. But that quiet carried a lesson. People began to understand that humans only see the surface of things. We see a collapsing house, a missing persons case, an unsolved mystery. But beneath our feet, there may be another world. Layers of history no one remembers, errors from the past covered in dust, mechanisms long abandoned, a frightened father's attempt at protection that became another family's fate. The earth does not speak, but it remembers. It holds footsteps. It holds whispers. It holds the last moments of children huddled together in a darkness they could not comprehend. The most haunting truth was not that the mystery had been solved, but that, beneath the soles of thousands of shoes, beneath decades of grass and frost and summer rain, 5 children had once sat together in silence, waiting for adults who never realized where to look. For many in Manchester, the lasting truth was not the tragedy itself. It was the reminder of how fragile life can be, how quietly things can break, how easily something old and forgotten can shift the world forever. On the final day of the memorial services, a young boy stared out at the empty field and asked his mother, "Does the earth get sad if it keeps secrets?" She placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "Every place has its stories. Not all of them are sad, but all of them want to be heard." The pastor smiled when he overheard it, because it captured something most adults take a lifetime to understand. The earth doesn't talk, but it tells stories through what it keeps, through forgotten tunnels, through sealed rooms, through the silences we walk over every day. And that silence is why the story of the Larkin Five became something the town chose never to forget, not to haunt themselves, but to remember that tragedy does not always wear the face of evil. Sometimes it's just time, decay, and the frailty of things we assume will last. The earth held those children for more than 3 decades, and when the truth finally rose to the surface, it felt as though the ground itself eased, no longer heavy, no longer burdened, just a field again, letting the wind pass freely. But for those who know the story, each time they walk by, they pause, not to listen for a sound, but to honor what lies beneath the surface of every life, the truth that the most important things are often hidden under the quietest ground.